So Dr. Thompson first came to my attention years ago. He was the Arkansas Surgeon General under both the Huckabee administration and Governor Beebe. And right now he's a professor at UAMS in pediatrics. But the reason he's here today is because of some groundbreaking research that he is heading up. It is funded by the National Institute of Health, and it is focusing on a lot of information on cannabis and how it's affecting the public, how this law is developing, this new law is developing, and how it's affecting Arkansas citizens and Arkansas patients most specifically. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask Dr. Thompson to talk about the research right now, what you guys are doing at the Institute.
Sure, Alan. Thank you for having us. And just truth in advertising, we're here to explore medical marijuana, the benefits or potential risks. We're uncertain what it is going to happen. It's part of the discussion we'll have here, I think, I hope to have, is why we are where we are and the lack of knowledge about medical cannabis. But our team at the Arkansas Center for Health Improvement and some researchers in the colleges of pharmacy and medicine at UAMS, a little over 2 years ago, as medical marijuana was coming onto the stage in Arkansas, put together a grant for the National Institute of Health to use some of the data resources that we've built over the last 2 decades at our center to evaluate what the effects of introducing medical marijuana was, whether it changed diagnoses, changed utilization of certain healthcare, whether it reduced opioid consumption, whether it caused more car crashes. So we put that grant in, didn't hear much for a while, and suddenly in September, the head of the Institute got very, very interested, called us up and said, we'd like to fund you. So in October, we started down this path.
And you guys are pretty much agnostic on, you're not an advocate and you're not a critic of cannabis. You're pretty much agnostic, and that's kind of what got them interested. Is that right?
That's exactly right. You know, this is a new major industry, a new major contribution to therapeutics, for which we really know very little about in any systematic way. And in fact, this was a report of the National Academy of Sciences with research on for the U.S. Congress from 2017. One of the findings, they said, they can't tell whether it's good or bad because there has not been any federal research.
It's been illegal to do the research, hasn't it?
Well, the challenges that you talked about with the formation of the Arkansas cannabis industry, whether that was banking or whether that was legality or other things. I want you to just think about this from a medical research institution's perspective. It's been a Schedule I drug by the FDA, so it's illegal. Declared as having no medical use. But any academic medical center, whether it's private or public, is totally dependent upon federal funds. Whether it's from research, NIH, whether it's from Medicaid or Medicare, CMS, another division of the Health and Human Services Department, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, yet a third division of Health and Human Services, or the CDC, a fourth, all of those federal agencies that academic research institutions are dependent upon as an illegal activity.
So if they start doing research, they run the risk possibly of losing funding.
Losing Medicaid, Medicare funding. And so that's why, of course, over the past decades, there's really not been the same level of investigation into cannabinoids as a potential medical therapeutic like other drugs.
But you're not really doing patient research. I mean, you're not doing studies on live patients. You're looking at behavior across a broad spectrum.
So let's go to the why, the what, and the how. We just dealt a little bit with the why. It's a big open question that we don't know, and clearly it's a growing presence, a growing industry, a growing number of users. I was at your session in August. The Consumer Day was very interesting because people are asking questions and asking for advice, but we don't necessarily have the scientific underpinnings to say, here's what we know works, or here's what we know you should avoid. We've got experience, but no really good studies that have been done. So what we proposed was our center, with the support of the legislature and the governors, including our current one, we run the Healthcare Transparency Initiative. This is a piece of legislation that was put in place in 2015, which has our center be able to get healthcare claims data, not with anybody's name on it, but just the claims data that are submitted for payment to Medicaid, to Medicare, to commercial companies. On those claims, and whether it's a doctor's visit or a prescription drug or a physical therapy visit, it has the diagnosis, and it has what was done, and it has what was paid. Well, in the legislation that established that, and in the subsequent legislation that established the rules and regulations for medical cannabis in Arkansas, was the ability to incorporate medical cannabis information into those data. So we're not touching a person. We don't know a person, but we're going to look to see over time, does the introduction of medical cannabis change the diagnoses that people have, potentially the prescriptions that people are taking.
So you're able to pair the fact, if I have a marijuana card, you're going to be able to know that this unidentified person has a medical marijuana card, and then you can look at his usage of pharmaceuticals and doctors and see if there's any change.
That is what the grant is to help us see if we can do. Let me give you what we can do now. Joe Thompson is in the Healthcare Transparency Initiative. My name is not there. I can't even find myself. Okay, it's a 45-digit unique identifier. But I'm on Delta Dental Insurance for my dental insurance, and I'm on United for my health insurance. And if they want to see when I had my tooth taken out, where I fill a prescription over here, that unique identifier shows that.
They don't have your name, though.
They don't have my name. Can't find me. In fact, if you came to me and said, I want my name out of there, I can't find you to take you out.
Okay.
So that's the setup. And so what we propose to do is to look at, as you suggested, people's purchase of medical marijuana. We're not actually seeing if you actually took it. We're seeing your purchases because that's recorded through the system on your card. On your card through BioTrack. Now it's 4N who bought them. They're going to put the unique identifier, and then we're going to match it so that we can actually, without anybody's information, watch to see if the healthcare utilization pattern changed.
So would you be able to go backward before I got my marijuana card or this person, and you're seeing that this person was getting had an opioid prescription and was renewing that prescription at a certain level. And then when I get my marijuana card, you're looking to see if maybe my opioid prescriptions are reduced and they go down?
You're exactly on line with what we proposed. The Transparency Initiative includes the utilization patterns of individuals back to 2013, 2014. The availability of medical marijuana, as you know, started in May of 2019. And so we're going to look at the 2 or 3 years before 2019 and the 2 or 3 years after 2019 and see what we see.
Can you imagine, let's say, of course, like you say, you're agnostic, you're not an advocate or a critic of cannabis, and you're doing this research, and you're going to have results in a couple of years?
I think it will be 2 years before we have solid results that we'll be able to report back.
How might this industry, what might you turn up that would be relevant to this industry, that might help this industry, or impact how they do business or how they justify themselves?
Well, I think we are in the midst of opioid epidemic that is only growing because of the COVID stress, mental duress, other things that have been we've been subjected to in the last 2 years. I think on the potential upside, the effect of medical marijuana on being a substitute for a much more harmful drug of addiction is a possibility. I think we'll need to see whether that plays out. That is one of the outcomes that we'll be looking for. So I think that's probably the one that got the National Institutes of Health's prioritization up, if you will, is because it's a Health and Human Services top priority, and we said we think we can have a way to look and see whether this is a potential benefit.
Um, okay. So, real briefly, give us a little bit of a history of marijuana,
Sure.
Going back to, I guess, the 1930s.
Well, I'm going to use my cheat sheet here because my policy team put this together, and I'm not as good on the legal stuff as some other folks. But this actually, I actually went back even before the 30s. This cannabis has been present in the United States for a long time. In fact, one of Hamilton in town, one of George Washington's top crops was hemp that he exported back to Europe.
It probably wasn't .03.
It was for making ropes and other things that. But move forward, and in the 1800s, the pharmaceutical there was no industry, and the pharmaceutical use was kind of the Wild West. We had lots of importation of opium, narcotic use, other things. I would strongly recommend, if any of you are in the New Orleans area, to go to the pharmacy museum there. It's the first licensed pharmacist in the United States, and they have a history of pharmaceutical paraphernalia that will shock you back into the early 1800s.
Really?
But in the 1800s, cannabis, along with some of the other drugs, got labeled as a poison because it was associated with bad outcomes. Now, it wasn't cannabis that you're selling because you got a pure product. It was, who knows what was in the bottle that was being passed out with bad outcomes. And so, in the early 1900s, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required labeling all medicines that were given out. It was kind of snake oil salesman. You buy a brown bottle that you didn't know what was in it. So that was the Pure Food and Drug Act, and it required labeling, including cannabis, if that was in the product that was being dispensed. In the mid-30s, Congress passed and regulated cannabis with the Marijuana Tax Act. Now, this was a little bit of an interesting approach. Congress decided to tax cannabis for industrial and medicinal reasons. So if you're using it for medicine, if you're using it for industry, it got taxed, which made it indirectly illegal to use it for something else. Okay, so they said, if you're going to use it, we're going to tax it. Oh, but if you're using it and it's not taxed, then you're violating the tax code. So it was an interesting kind of backdoor way of controlling non-medicinal or non-industrial use of cannabis in the 30s. Still, we're having problems with not cannabis specifically, but in the pharmaceutical and food and cosmetic arenas, contamination, everything. So in the late 30s, the Pure Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act got put in place. This was superseded in 1970, at least for medicines, by the Controlled Substances Act. So that gave us our schedule of drugs. And that's when cannabis first got put into kind of the Schedule 1, no medical, therapeutic, and therefore no legitimate investigation of cannabis as a drug.
Do you think that the impetus to make marijuana illegal to begin with was sort of or to sort of start the war on drugs was really sort of a war on the counterculture back in the 70s and 60s?
I don't know that I can clearly any political decision has multiple reasons for people coming together to actually get to a majority of vote or a super majority vote if that's required. I think there has been a long history predating the 70s, beyond cannabis, of the drug, of medical therapeutics not having snake oil cells, things, that haven't been reviewed in the future. So that means that it's some standardization in our pharmaceutical industry. I think, it's not unlikely that what you're suggesting was at least one of the political streams of thought in that process.
So right now, Eddie Armstrong is going to be talking today with on the recreational initiative that's coming out. But if that passes, how does that affect your research? Does it muddy the water for you guys in terms of being able to identify these behaviors?
I do think if that passes, it will put an endpoint on what we're able to do, at least as far as I understand it. The likelihood for an individual, have individuals that want to continue getting a card and using the benefits of the dispensaries and the knowledge of the pharmacist and the therapeutic, guides in the dispensaries. But if it's recreational, a certain proportion of the folks will just go to recreational. And I think we've got a window here to look to see what the medical effect is.
That'll close when it becomes recreational.
But I think we'll have recreational or medical marijuana was available in May of 16. It's February of 22. It'll be 23 if it passes before that recreational effect. So we'll have a 5-year window. I think we'll have a good study window.
I want to just right now, if I could open this up to questions. If you all have any questions for Dr. Thompson, anybody would like to ask Dr. Thompson any questions about what the work he's doing or the outcomes. If not, we can just rattle on for another 10 minutes. So, any questions out there right now? Hey, yo.
We've not operationalized that yet in our study. Obviously, since COVID is present during our study period, we're going to have to examine the effects of COVID on not only healthcare utilization but also medical marijuana consumption or at least purchase. We will get into that. That's one of the things that we're going to have to have some controls for. Alan, you mentioned earlier, and if I can just add, you mentioned the current study that we're proposed really does not touch a person or engage a consumer of medical marijuana. We do think that there are some avenues that NIH will be interested in, and we do have the legal ability through the Transparency Initiative that if one of our researchers wants to get a group of individuals together to do more investigation on a certain treatment plan or experience, then we may have arms of this research that extend and add to what we're doing.
But that would be voluntary.
It would be totally voluntary. People would consent to participate, and obviously they would have protections in place for their confidentiality and privacy.
What kind of research might they wind up doing there?
Well, I am the most uninformed person probably here today, except maybe my communications director, who's here with me also, Sandra McGrew. On, when I was at your consumer event in August, many of your exhibitors had treatment plans for different types of conditions that they would recommend somebody try to follow. Different strains, different, dosing, different periodicity of how often and what quantities. And, if you were in a more traditional pharmaceutical trial, all that stuff would be in a very controlled situation, and you would know, what worked, what didn't work. It may be that there are opportunities in the future for some of those treatment pathways to be more formally assessed. We're going to open this up. Once we start this pathway, there will be investigators who say, I want to study the treatment of multiple sclerosis with medical plants. And so they will enroll people with multiple sclerosis in a more formal way and have what has been a traditional study of lymphoma or leukemia or name your disease that we've had a good study on. These may be opportunities for studies in the future with respect to the impact of medical cannabis.
One thing that I've heard discussed back in August at our first one and also currently is really the lack of medical information that's available to patients. I mean, we've got people like Dr. Nickel, and there's a few doctors that have put in the effort to become informed and knowledgeable. But there's so many. I mean, this could be some pretty potent stuff, and yet we have people sort of self-medicating because they know more than the doctors know in many instances. And so this brings me to the question: you hang out with doctors all day, and what is their attitude towards medical marijuana? What do you hear?
There are 1,000 different perspectives on this if you talk to 1,000 different doctors. So let me just start with that. There's not one unified perspective. I think to a large extent, this therapeutic modality is still independent and not integrated with medical therapy. In fact, I would be willing to bet that there may even be a majority of medical cannabis users, their provider or healthcare lead may not know that they're self-medicating. And so, I think there is a need to, if this is going to be present, let's figure out how it fits with more traditional medicine so that we optimize the benefits to patients and we minimize whatever risks there may be.
Do you think it's going to require federal descheduling or legalization before doctors go all in on learning and using? I mean, do they feel that they're at risk, that their licenses are at risk by getting involved with medical marijuana?
I think early on, there was a perception that their licensure could be at risk. I think there's less concern now because there's not been any actions that negated a physician's license. I do think there will require, just because the federal government pays so much on health care, through Medicare for everybody over age 65, for Medicaid for more than 50% of our pregnancies and children are Medicaid across the nation. Yeah. The federal government is a big funder, and with that funding comes rules, regulations, and control. And so I think there is going to need to be something to at least lower the threat perception to have that integration happen. Now, candidly, I'm quite optimistic. If we got called by the director of one of the institutes at the NIH that said, "We want to study this." That didn't happen last year. In fact, we put our grant in last year, and we got a pretty good score, but no funding. We revised and submitted it again in July, and that's when they first found our first grant to call us back and say, "We want you to do the first grant." We said, "Okay." So, there is, I think, a growing awareness, at least within the scientific community in the federal government. There's obviously growing pressure in the political sense in that states are legalizing both medical and recreational marijuana. I think you've got a criminal justice issue that is increasingly recognizing the disparities of the war on drugs and its impact on low-income communities and communities of color. So I think, like we talked about before, there are several of those political streams that may come together to actually get to a political decision.
Folks, I think we're about out of time. Is there any other questions? Anyone like to ask Dr. Thompson anything before we move on? Okay, well, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Dr. Thompson. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to have a conversation between Erica G. with Wright, Lindsay, and Jennings, and Eddie Armstrong, who's heading up the Responsible Growth Arkansas initiative for adult use cannabis. That'll be coming up. That's what we mentioned earlier. So I think that'll be a really interesting conversation to see where this effort is going, what the polling is, what the sense of the public is. So we'll reconvene here in 5 minutes.